Hello, and welcome to a brand new season of The Future Of. I'm your host, Azam Faruqi. It's been a few months since season two. A few things led us to being a few months behind our schedule, but we are back and we have an exciting roster of guests lined up for you. Some of the topics we're aiming to cover this season includes innovation, investing, and Web 3.0. And since February is the Black History Month, there's going to be a bonus episode about the history of African American baseball with an emphasis on Negro leagues. However, based on our schedule, it is likely that that episode may get published in early March. For those of you who are new to the podcast, the Future of aims to look at various aspects of our lives, whether they're political, social, technological, or even economics. We take those topics and try and understand how we got from the starting point to where we're at today. And what does the future look like? We've received a lot of positive feedback, and despite being behind on our schedule, we've seen some of our episodes do really well. You can subscribe to our podcast at Apple, Spotify, Google, as well as on YouTube. Our first episode today is The Future of Innovation. Our guest is Matt Clancy. Matt is an emerging venturist and the creator of New Things Under the Sun website and newsletter. He's also a Progress Studies Fellow and covers a lot of academic work around research and development and innovation. If this is a topic that interests you and you'd like to learn more about it, I would highly recommend subscribing to his newsletter. We'll provide the links in the description of the episode. As part of our conversation with Matt, we covered a lot of ground. From defining innovation, where do ideas come from? What is its role in a globalized world? What are some of the factors that are driving innovation? And of course, what does the future look like? This episode was recorded on January the 14th of this year, and we hope you enjoy it as much as we did. So let's give it a listen. Hi, thank you for joining us, Matt.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the very basic for the purpose of our audience and viewers. Can you define what innovation is?
Yeah, so there's kind of like a technical academic definition that I am aware of, and it has its place, but I don't like it as much. So in the technical parlance, like there's invention and there's innovation, and they're distinct. Invention is like the creation of a new product or process, and innovation is about sort of improving it, bringing it to market, and kind of commercializing it. I tend to not like that so much because, like, improving, I don't see this fine distinction necessarily. Like, you're always doing something new to improve, whether you're improving something or creating something new. I don't think it's necessarily that there's this binary thing between those two. So I tend to just always talk about innovation, which is, just improving or doing something new. And the way I like to think of innovation is it's the creation of something that is novel, interesting, and replicable or repeatable. So, I can do something that's never been done before, and it's really interesting. Like I could, but I can't. It's a one-off miracle. That's not an innovation. Innovation has to be like a blueprint for a new technology or a scientific discovery that I can transmit to other people. So what I try to sort of focus on is stuff that is new, interesting in the sense that it's valuable. It's not just random, and then repeatable.
Awesome. And what generally drives innovation?
So, there's a lot of pieces that drive innovation. So you can talk about kind of the abstract idea of sort of where do new ideas come from? And then you can talk more about the physical world, like how do they get implemented, and, who are the people discovering them and pushing them out there? So if you start in kind of the murky realm of ideas, where do ideas come from in general? Like, it's really tempting to say it's just sort of unknown. It's this lightning in a jar and you can't capture it. But I think, people do have sort of strategic ways to find new ideas. One common idea is that there is this notion of something called the adjacent possible, which is, um, you know, going from an automobile, a gas-powered automobile, to an electrical, like a Tesla style car, after lithium batteries have been invented, is kind of like an adjacent possible. There's a smaller step to make that change than if we had done that, say, 50 years ago. In principle, if you put all the same pieces together and you knew what to do, you could have invented anything at any time. But it tends to be easier to make sort of small steps that adapt existing technologies or combine existing technologies in new ways. And the set of what is sort of one step further is sort of always changing and tends to be expanding as the set of components and things we know expands. And we call that the adjacent possible. And so that's one place that ideas sort of can come from. And another is, science is always, or not science, innovation is always about stepping into the unknown and doing something new that hasn't been done before. And science, or more broadly, just sort of models of reality that are simplifications, can help us navigate in these kind of uncertain places. And so we actually have studies about, for example, when an inventor invents in a new domain that they don't know before, like they're switching to a new topic, if they are able to use sort of science, like textbooks, and we tell this by, do they cite scientific articles and things like this, they tend to basically are able to catch up to the frontier and perform roughly as well as people who are experts who have been in that field for a long time, than if that kind of scientific underpinning is not there. So we say that sort of like science serves as this map of an unknown terrain. And then another place that ideas come from is sometimes it's just accidents, right? Like people are tinkering or just evolution is mutating things. And as long as you have the ability to notice stuff that is an improvement, or there's some mechanism to hold on to things that improve on the past, that's another place that new ideas come from. So that's that. And then I can also talk about the other side of it, how do they come into the world, kind of like what's actually happening. So you have to start with people, at least right now. What drives innovation is, people who are motivated to seek solutions to problems. And so it's not just that there's more people, so there's more innovators. People don't necessarily think of problems they face as things that can be solved with new approaches. Often the attitude is problems we face are mitigated, and we find a way to deal with them without overturning them. So we accept that they impose limits on us, and then we try to figure out how to live within those limits. And innovation is often more about questioning, are those really limits, and are there ways that we can break those and go and do something different? And that kind of outlook is not necessarily just something naturally that people think of. So there's a lot of evidence on entrepreneurship, for example, which is sort of related, a close cousin to innovation. That people trying to form new businesses is another sort of way of solving problems that are out there. And most people are not entrepreneurs, but one thing that makes a person more likely to become an entrepreneur is if they get exposed socially to the idea that people like them have been entrepreneurs. And so it gets the wheels turning. At least that's my view, that this is, maybe I too could think that way and do something new and different. And, some people think that may have also happened to humanity. Basically, in the Industrial Revolution, we went millennia upon millennia where innovation was this not really a big part of how things were. Like, most people's lives looked similar to the lives of the people who came before them. And in fact, there's some, maybe innovation in this era tended to blow up in your face. Like, things had been done this way for a very long time. And there's sort of this cultural evolution argument that the reason that we do it that way is because that's the way we discovered works. For example, processing food, and maybe if we try to invent a new shortcuts to process our food, maybe we don't do it as well and we get sick and die. This is like an idea discussed in Joseph Henrich's book, Secret of Our Success. And he has this really cool, these discussions of like processing toxic plants, getting rid of the toxins. So in that kind of world, if you deviate from from tradition, basically, it tends to be risky. And so it's discouraged. But in the 1800s, maybe we had learned enough, or maybe enough had changed that suddenly inventing started to pay off and it became more common. And I think as it became more common, the culture transitioned and it became acceptable and even normal to think like, well, we expect people to try to solve, to find solutions and solve them. But even now, it's not like a universal thing. And you see in like, if you talk to people from, say, Silicon Valley, they do tend to have like a different outlook. Like I talk to them about my own plans and this and that, and their way of thinking is just sort of different than necessarily other regions I've been. So yeah, you have people looking to innovate, equipping them with knowledge, like we've talked about, can help make their efforts more fruitful. You have to have resources like and incentives to innovate. So things you have to be in an environment where innovations can flourish and you can be compensated somehow for them. And then last but not least, you have to be in an environment where sort of these things are allowed to take root and there's not sort of regulation that stops up everything. So that's you asked a very big question, what drives innovation? And that you got a very long answer.
Awesome. So just going back to the entrepreneurship piece that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. So is there a causal relationship between entrepreneurship and innovation? Does one precede the other, or there's no hard and fast rule there?
I mean, I think they're just kind of close cousins. Like you can be an entrepreneur who is setting up a business based on a sort of template that has been, you're running your own business, but it's not necessarily a high-tech business or driven by a new invention. It's maybe, opening a new restaurant or something like that. That's a great thing. And it is in some sense doing something new and different, but not necessarily in the same way as inventing a new product or service, but a lot of inventions for them to, like a lot of new things, create new companies around them, and that's how they take off. But even there, it's not always the case. You can also have, a big, large firm that creates new products and processes too. So I think they're related, but they're not identical.
Awesome. And in order for innovation to be successful, what are some of the factors you would look for? So if you're talking about an innovative culture of a country or of a corporation, mm-hmm. what are some of this, maybe the environment or the social factors that you would look for?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think like being around people, like just being around people who invent and innovate is probably the big thing that I kind of see academic evidence for. There's probably other research on other cultural things. I'm less aware of it. But I think there's pretty robust evidence. For example, we've done literally experiments where, not me, but people have literally done experiments where you are teaching a class on innovation and entrepreneurship. You pair the students up with mentors and you randomly assign their mentors either somebody in the industry or an entrepreneur in the industry. And the people who are assigned an entrepreneur go on and they're more likely to join a startup, for example. Or if you work at a company and the company happens to employ more people who started their own business in the past, you're more likely to go on and start your own business in the next 5-10 years. So I think that's one important part, is just sort of giving people the idea that this is a thing you can do. There is also, that's not the whole story. Some of these other studies have found, for example, that being around, once you have that idea, like people are considering the path of being an entrepreneur, being around entrepreneurs who sort of tell them, kind of help them decide this is a bad idea, this is a good idea. That can make a difference too. Like there's a famous study in Harvard Business School where students get matched up in these big class, I don't know what you call them, class blocks, right? And you're sort of randomly assigned a bunch of peers and you go to all your classes together. And people who are going to Harvard Business School are probably already thinking, maybe I'll be an entrepreneur, maybe I'll do something new. And for them, being around more fellow students who started their own business in the past doesn't really seem to make them more likely to start businesses. It actually seems to make them less likely to, but it seems to make them less likely to start new businesses that are sort of less likely to succeed. So in this case, they're kind of getting good, useful feedback from people. Other stuff that can help a culture, the free exchange of ideas and sort of a loose, an ability to make new connections and meet new people and not kind of get locked into a given social group and sort of where it's stale and you're always exchanging the same ideas, I think is another important element and something that a lot of companies have traditionally emphasized.
Awesome. So just to adding to that, so it seems that, usually when we have these conversations about the importance of cities and why cities have historically been successful, we hear terms like agglomeration and sharing of knowledge and so on and so forth. So I remember you wrote a blog post in December of 2019, so this is pre-pandemic, that the strength of local knowledge spillover is falling. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And does the pandemic act as a catalyst for that?
Yeah, so a big thing I've been focusing on quite a lot over the last year or more has been the effect of remote work on innovation. And my basic view is that the traditional link between sort of cities, physical proximity, agglomeration, dense people, and innovation has weakened significantly over time due to new technology. And therefore, it makes more sense for more industries than in the past to basically adopt a fully remote setting. Because from a perspective of increasing innovation, you take less of a hit when you can communicate effectively at a distance than in the era when you couldn't. And also, being able to work with people at a great distance allows you to form collaborative partnerships that would not otherwise be possible. And that's sort of that's the boost, that's the gain, and then there's also this loss. It's not quite clear how it's going to shake out. But I think that a lot of the traditional evidence on agglomeration economies is sort of based on, one, older era technology when it really wasn't as easy to communicate at a distance, and two, a pre-remote work way of organizing society. So in a world where remote work is really niche and everybody kind of believes that you need to be close, everybody believes the agglomeration economy's story, especially large companies, well, then they're going to set up their companies to take advantage of that. And if you want to work with the most resources and with sort of the brightest minds, you go to the companies that have set up their way of operating to take advantage of agglomeration economies that they think are there. So in the data, it's going to therefore look like, these agglomeration economies still really work well, and that people who go to work on Facebook campus or Google campus are more innovative than people who stay away. And that's because, but I would say it's because they're having access to the minds and resources of those companies, and they would actually do reasonably well at a distance. And I think we actually have quite a lot of data to support this, but I don't think it had been appreciated as much until kind of the COVID-19 pandemic forced everyone to try remote work a lot more seriously. But you can one way you can track this is you can look at citations that academics make to each other, or you can look at the citations that patents make to each other. And in both cases, the link between distance and the probability of citation has been weakening a long time for decades. You can also look at things like patents per capita. It used to be that in cities, you just had a lot more patents per person than in less densely populated places, at least in the United States. That's still true, but it's just not as true as it used to be. The strength of that relationship has weakened since the 1960s or so. Or you can look at, there's some interesting, evidence on collaboration patterns. There's this one study that's kind of grim, and it's about looking at what happens to people when one of their collaborators unexpectedly passes away. And this is in the life sciences. They're looking at kind of superstar elite scientists, and they've identified a set of something like 100 or maybe 200 of these elite life scientists who unexpectedly passed away in the middle of active research careers. And they look at what happens to all their collaborators, and as you would expect, all their collaborators are less productive than they would. But the thing that's interesting about sort of remote work is you can also parcel this out and say, well, what happens to the collaborators who were in the same department, so they were able to work face-to-face with these guys, versus their collaborators who were located at different universities? And if being face-to-face is really important, you would expect to see like those guys suffer more when their collaborative partner disappears than people who already had this kind of arm's length relationship with them. But you don't see that in the data either. And then the last thing, because I can go on about this for a long time, is, we've got studies of academics moving around. And for example, economists and finance professors moving from department to department. And you can see what happens to their research output as they move to, say, a top 25 university. And if being face-to-face and able to communicate with these top scholars is expected to lead them to be a lot better researchers and be more productive, then you should expect to see their productivity in terms of, the number of papers they write, adjusted for quality as best you can and stuff. You would expect to see that to jump when they move to these departments. And in the 1970s, you did see that, which kind of confirms what you would think. But the effect was weaker in the 80s. And then by the 90s, it had basically disappeared. And again, I think this is because academia has kind of led the way on, has sort of inadvertently been forced to adapt a remote collaborative style way in advance of everybody else. Because say the tech sector, it's private sector companies, they can ask everyone to move to the same place, Silicon Valley, and we're all going to work together. We don't have to figure out how to collaborate effectively at a distance. But academia is tied to sort of the population of the United States, because they got to teach students, and the students are where they are, and they're not all you can't get all the academics in the same city. And so academics had to get used to collaborating at a distance. And basically, I think that it works. Like, we see very little evidence that academics who are, most academics collaborate at a distance now with people in different universities who may be hundreds of miles away. And it doesn't seem to have any significant impact on the productivity of their work. But, there's a trade-off, and I can talk also about the things that I think face-to-face does well, if you want to stick on that topic.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So what is it that the face-to-face still brings that you're unable to do it in a remote setting? What are the unintended consequences? I guess they're unintended, so we don't know yet. But what are some of the things that you might see as a potential barrier?
I think there's there's short-term stuff that's more easily solvable, and then there's longer-term stuff that is a lot more unknown. So the short-term thing is there are certain kinds of activities that are hard to do remotely, and they often whiteboard thinking is something people list here. So getting a group of people in a room, sitting a whiteboard up and having them kind of sketch out an idea. In general, kind of this more looser, setting the agenda, figuring out what the goals are, that work. Some people, there's some evidence that doesn't work as well remotely. Remote work is great for when everybody has their role and needs to sort of focus on their part. And they can do that with less distraction when they're able to sort of work from home and control their environment. The issue is that's a solvable problem. At a minimum, you can just fly to a retreat and get everybody together and figure out what they're supposed to do and then depart. And that's actually, not that different than what a lot of academics do. They'll meet up at conferences, or they'll literally have a weekend where they all get together on a project and they figure stuff out and then they go away. And then there's also lots of technology that's evolving all the time that might make this possible. We now have these digital whiteboards where they're the size of a regular whiteboard, and I'm writing in my room, you're writing 100 miles away on yours, but they're linked, and maybe that will solve the problem. I think the harder problem to solve, though, is about social connections and meeting people. So all of this remote technology works really well, I think, when people already know each other and have this connection, because we've established some trust. We can communicate via email. We know each other's routines a bit, and it just seems to work. But how do I meet you in the first place is a lot more of a sort of sketchy subject, because like those academics, they work together at a distance, great. But if you look at how they meet their long distance collaborators, a lot of the time, like more than half the time, it was during a period when they were physically in the same place together. So they were colleagues at a department, and then one of them moved away and they kept working together. Or they were advisor and advisee, and then one of them went on to their next job. Or they were, PhD student and advisor, same deal. One of them graduated, they move away. A lot of academics still meet at things like conferences where you're, physically together, but only for a weekend or a week or something like that. But it's unclear, how well that's going to work in other industries that don't necessarily have these kind of in-person things. And maybe it'll be just a conference circuit will need to evolve. And the thing that we literally just don't know, I think it has just not been studied well, is how well online social networks work to facilitate meetings. For example, I'm really active on Twitter. I don't know if I'm really active, but I'm active on Twitter. And I've met a lot of people on Twitter that I have now professional type relationships with. And some of them I have met a lot of them now in person, but it was not started in person and continued over Twitter. It was started on Twitter. And, from my perspective, an interaction on Twitter is not as good as an interaction in the real world. But I can meet way more people in a much shorter time. I just am exposed to way more people in a short period of time than is easy to do in the real world. So that's a trade-off. And I think we just literally don't know if that trade-off is enough or not. And in the future, there'll probably be other, online ways to meet people. Like, if the metaverse takes off in the way that is sort of envisioned, maybe that will do the job. But yeah, we just don't know. And I think that, there's been these other studies about inventors meeting each other, usually by being physically proximate. And the thing that is really useful about being physically proximate is you meet people that you wouldn't necessarily normally meet in the course of your own discipline in your field. So I'm an economist. I work on economics of innovation, and I have a reasonably good sense of who the people are who work in this. I read their papers, we see each other at conferences, and so on. But what if there's like an idea from, say, an economist who works on cryptocurrencies, and it's really relevant for what I do, but I don't know that. If we were in the same department, we're forced to get lunch, we might get talking about our work and realize we have this connection. But we're not going to seek each other out because we don't know that there's anything valuable out there in the other person to be sought out. And so, inventors who used to be in the same place, and if they are in sort of if they work on different technologies, they're more likely when they move away. It seems like being close facilitated the meeting of these sort of unlikely people, and they're less likely to meet strange people, I guess you would say, when they're geographically distant. And so that's, I think, the big uncertainty about remote work, in my view. And it'll be it's very hard to know how it'll play out, because the COVID-19 implementation of remote work was so weird anyway. Like, all of the normal ways you would meet people if you lived in the same city were truncated as well. So it was a weird time, and like nobody was having an easy time meeting people. But as we move into a future where that's not so much of an issue, I think that will be, in my view, that's the big open question. I think I'm like more of an optimist, but if I think I'm wrong, I think that would be the big reason.
And it's interesting you say that, because when I think a lot about, how sometimes people would get ideas is, so yeah, it's one thing you're meeting at a conference, or you're running into each other in an academic setting, like you said, one is working on crypto and your innovation. That's But then there's the other piece. So sometimes I might get together with my friends, not discussing work at all, right?
Right.
So it might be an engineer, there's someone in computer sciences, someone is in account, and you sit down, you have those normal conversations, and somehow, sometimes a light bulb clicks. It doesn't have to be an entrepreneurial idea. It could be something, someone says, and I'm like, okay, this is something I can probably tinker with at work myself. So it's those pieces, because you're not sitting down with the intention of working on something. It's just something that's a bit of a spillover effect, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Because I think that 99, maybe 999 out of 1,000 times, those conversations don't result in a new innovative idea. And so when the rate of return is so low, it's not like I'm going to start scheduling meetings with just random people
For sure.
in the hopes that this will happen. But if they're your friends, you don't go because you're looking for an idea. Like you said, that's a spillover. And I think that's something like being in person, just making meeting people and like interacting with people pleasurable. And like sometimes something good comes out of it, but it's like subsidizing it, right? Like we
Mhm.
want to subsidize things that people don't find it individually rational to do, but which are good for society. And, the fun of just hanging out with people is a way of subsidizing from a perspective of maximizing innovation and so on. And I do think there is one other piece of like being in person, which is there are some kinds of knowledge that are difficult to convey remotely. And there are kinds of work that is really hard to do remotely. So this is often called tacit knowledge. So knowledge that is, you can write down anything. You can teach somebody how to ride a bike over a book if you want to. It's just a lot harder. And so as an economist, I think in terms of costs and benefits, like there are some kinds of communication, some kinds of knowledge that is just much cheaper to convey in person, and it's really expensive to convey via the written word and really hard to learn it. And so in those kinds of worlds, you want those people, like firms that get people together where that kind of knowledge is important and have them in the same place will tend to outperform firms that need to codify everything and distribute it to their sort of remote group. And so I don't think everything will go remote. My hope is actually that we learn what kinds of industries work well remotely and which ones don't. And the ones that can be done remotely kind of clear out and lower real estate costs for the ones that really do need to be in the downtown dense part of the cluster, because they have to talk and do stuff like show how to titrate stuff. I don't know. That is hard to describe over the internet. But even there, like the technology for conveying information isn't only the written word anymore, and that's more technology. You can easily, it's cheap to make videos now and send them around, for example.
Awesome. So let's move on to the productivity piece a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So you've written a little bit about it as well. There's a very famous paper from John Van Reenen, talks about his innovation or rate of innovation slowing down.
Mm-hmm.
Is it getting harder to find new ideas now?
Yeah. So this is a big topic. And I think the answer is yes, if you define ideas appropriately. So, what is an idea is sort of this nebulous concept, and you can get bogged down in it. Like, the idea for the CRISPR gene editing tool versus the idea for some part of the process that was important versus like the idea of how I'm going to write up, like you can break ideas are like constant, right? Like I'm having ideas about what word I'm going to say next. So that's really nebulous. But if you define an idea as something like however much knowledge it takes to improve whatever it is, the thing you're caring about by say 1%, then it is getting harder to do that. Okay. So it's taking more and more R&D effort to improve by any benchmark you care about by a fixed percentage. Okay. And you might say, well, why do we care about percentages? Why not absolute units? Well, we're kind of used to the idea of exponential growth. That's how our economies traditionally grow. And so we sort of like, that's kind of what we want to happen. And we're learning that is getting increasingly hard to do. So for example, the famous paper said like Moore's law, the doubling of the number of computer chips or circuits, the number of transistors on a circuit every 2 years Yeah, that pace of doubling has been really consistent for like 50 years, but the number of research effort being devoted at solving that problem is not constant. It's increased dramatically over the same period. It's like 20 times higher now than it was 50 years ago. So each doubling is taking 20 times as much effort. And you can look at crop yields, like a completely different domain. A 1% improvement in corn, soy, wheat, whatever yields, so that's like, output per acre, is also getting harder in the sense that there's more and more research effort devoted to those problems. They've done this for health too, like how many years of life are saved for every clinical trial that's conducted and for every academic article written. It seems to take more articles and more trials for each year of life now. They've done this for machine learning, not that paper, but a different paper looked at improving these machine learning benchmarks. It seems to be like a much faster rate of improvement, or there's a much faster growth rate of the number of computer scientists working on that than there is the growth rate of these things. And yeah, you can look at it. You can look at it other ways too. Like you can try to measure really broad measures of innovation called total factor productivity, or sort of the profitability of companies, and all these things point in the same direction. I should also I want to say, like with social science, everything in social science is like a tendency on average to do this, right? Like there are always, like you can always find exceptions, but like even in corn and wheat and all that stuff, like there were some years where some crops improved at a constant rate with a constant number of research evidence, but that wasn't the general tendency. Or in life sciences, there were some years where, we got a flurry of new discoveries that saved lots of lives without that much extra effort. But that tends to be, again, the exception rather than the rule. But I don't want to say it's like mechanistic, like this is always how it is.
Absolutely. So my question is, first of all, is there a cause for concern? Because I mean, if you think about it, that is how naturally things progress, right? So if you think about the Industrial Revolution and progress since then, development of the scientific process in the 18th century, like we were starting off from a very low base, so the rate of return would be higher, the marginal value. Initially, I guess it was the law of increasing returns. We've reached a point that now it's diminishing returns. So is that really a cause of concern? Or if not, what are its implications?
Yeah, so there's two senses. One is, yeah, it's as you would expect. Hey, it's not surprising everything has diminishing returns. The thing that's a little bit surprising is some people think that knowledge is different, in that there's this standing on the shoulders of geniuses idea, where whenever we come up with a new idea, it can help us see further than people who came before. And so if we had lived in a world where innovation was getting easier, well, then people would say, well, that's what you would expect. That's that. So anyway, you can like whatever the outcome is, I can imagine people being like, well, that's what we would expect. But the sense in which it's not an issue is that even if it gets harder and harder to improve things by a fixed amount, the resources available to us continue to grow at a steady clip. And innovation hasn't necessarily, like there's a separate debate about whether innovation has slowed down, but it is not a given that things get harder, which means they must slow down, because even as things have gotten harder, we have dramatically scaled up the amount of effort we put into them. But we've done that without, we've been able to do that using a roughly constant share of our economy's resources. So like roughly fluctuates between 2 and 3% of US GDP is devoted to R&D. And it's been that way for, over 50 years. The economy has grown a lot over the same 50 years, which means in absolute levels, the R&D resources are a lot higher than they were 50 years ago, but it's still not taxing, it's still only 3 in 100 people working on this kind of stuff. Now, where you get into a potential issue is there's a view that the most fundamental constraint is not like dollars, resources, but it's people specifically. Like you need minds to innovate. And there's a view that the number of the number of people that it takes to innovate can't go up can't increase forever, because whereas the economy grows at a like 2 or 3% per year, our global population is still growing, but a lot of people think that that is not going to last forever, and that we're going to hit a plateau, and then the number of people on the earth is going to sort of stay fixed at a level. And if the number of people that need to keep innovating has to keep growing to grow for the growth rates that we're used to continue, that's not sustainable forever, unless you can move out and off world or somehow get fertility rates going. What you would need is a way to transform resources, so basically dollars, into minds. And so artificial intelligence, machine learning, whatever the stuff that we currently need our brains to do for innovating, if we can come up with a way to do that without needing human beings to necessarily do it, well, then you don't necessarily have any problem. But if you can't crack that nut, that's kind of the long run fear people have.
That's awesome. Yeah, because so far, when I was reading the paper, I mean, they mentioned that economic growth is a product of research productivity and number of researchers. And so far, they said it was the researchers that was going up, but the number of, the productivity itself was coming down. But one of the other things that they also mentioned is that it seems that the research productivity falls in half every 13 years. And just to keep up with the existing rate of growth, the US needs to double its efforts, the amount of research efforts. So when you feel that, okay, so if you have two, one is the number of researchers, one is the product, like the research productivity. So if the number of researchers is finite, let's say hypothetically, if that's a constraint, what kind of effort do you need? So artificial intelligence is one. What else are you looking at?
Yeah, so this gets into some kind of tricky technical details of these sort of macroeconomic models. But the famous Van Reenen paper about our ideas getting harder to find, they kind of talk about effective number of researchers, and what I've been kind of calling research effort, which is you take the amount that we spend on research and you divide it by the typical salary, and that's how many people you could, in theory, employ to if you spent all your money on manpower. But that's not actually what people do. They spend their research dollars on people plus equipment and capital. Okay. And the key idea, and there's sort of this other school of thought by some of the same authors. It's just other papers that really focus on this importance of the people. And what it comes down to is how substitutable are these two things? Like, what can you do to augment a person's brain power? Or, is there a sense in which you can have, instead of two people, one person with the right kinds of stuff? So like that could be, as I said, in artificial intelligence, it tends to but it could also be stuff like, access to all the world's scientific libraries, cataloged with a really efficient search engine so they can find just what they want, capabilities to do really good simulations, anything that, they need to do research and that maybe they had to do themselves. Anything that can be offloaded can kind of slow the need for human beings. But we kind of have this view that there's some degree in which people are fundamentally sort of non-substitutable. Like there is some stuff they do that that only they can do, at least until we discover like a true sort of artificial intelligence that is like intelligent in the same way that we are. And that's the tough part. And it seems like we're a long way from there. Like we're a long way from that. We're a long way from, I don't know if we're a long way from artificial and general intelligence, but we're a long way from this issue really binding significantly, I think, because even if the population of potential researchers is fixed, we have tons of people all throughout the world who don't have realistic or easy ways to become those researchers. They're kind of trapped in poverty or other things that, there's a big pool of sort of potential lost Einsteins, they're called, that are out there. And so we probably have, I would think, like decades before we need to seriously worry about this. But people are sort of pointing it out as an obstacle that's down the road.
Awesome. So before moving on from this, there's just one last question I want to ask, because this was a post you wrote, and I found it very fascinating. It was about knowledge as a constraint, or the burden of knowledge.
Yeah.
So your argument being that obviously human beings get replaced and the new person has to learn everything from scratch. And I think there's the time it takes for researchers to write the first, I think, solo papers has, like, the average age has also gone up a little bit, right? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is this idea called the burden of knowledge, and it was sort of first articulated by this economist of innovation called Ben Jones. I'm sure it's like a kind of common sense idea in some degrees, but he was, I think, the first to really draw attention to it and sort of draw some of the implications. But the idea is basically that advancing tends to always take more knowledge than doing new things tends to take more knowledge than doing old things, because if we do whatever we can with the knowledge we have, and then if you want to do more, you got to know more. And as you said, the challenge is that all that new knowledge has to be learned by people, and so we reset the clock every generation and have to sort of rebuild the knowledge, and then we can apply it. And you can see this effect in like three different areas. So one is, as you mentioned, the age at which people have enough knowledge to basically contribute has risen. They've done studies on Nobel Prize winners. The age that they make their Nobel Prize winning contribution went up something like 8 years over the 20th century, from the beginning to the end. And they do models to try to see how much of this is accounted for by just the fact that people live longer, and so they're more likely to come up with ideas throughout that whole lifespan, including when they're older. That can explain only like part of it, but the rest, the rest of it seems to be that it just takes longer to finish your PhD, and more of them need PhDs. It seemed to get PhDs before they do Nobel Prize winning work. And it's not just Nobel Prize winners. You can look at the same thing for just like economists and mathematicians, as you said, when they publish their first paper. There's some evidence on inventors. It's not, I think it's a little bit less consistent. Like, inventors were getting older at the age at which they made their first invention, but then it started to go down a little bit, which might have something to do with like the computer revolution, creating a new set of knowledge that was sort of untapped and virgin. And so you could be Mark Zuckerberg and make a big contribution without being an experienced older researcher. So there's the age side, but I said there's like three aspects of this burden of knowledge. The second is teams. So this has been across the board. The number of people working on papers or patents, the size of the team of people has been rising across like all fields over a really long time period. And then the third is a specialization. So one way to adapt to this burden of knowledge is to not try to learn as much. So instead of me needing to know, maybe in the beginning of the 20th century, if I'm Einstein, I just learn all of physics. And now I don't learn all of physics. I don't learn anything with general relativity. I just learn what I need for my string theory, and I specialize in that. And I don't actually know that much about other domains, but I have learned enough to tackle my narrow slice. And when I need to go beyond that, I team up with people who have the other chunks of knowledge I need. And there's a lot of evidence also that people are specializing a lot more. Like, inventors are less likely to jump from inventing in one kind of technology to another. When academics switch from research on one topic to another topic, they tend to get less citations on the new topic because they're less experienced, but sort of the penalty of that has grown over time. So that's suggesting that it's getting harder and harder to make a strong contribution when you're in a different field. And so this is kind of all, trends basically that are explained by this burden of knowledge idea. But there is one really kind of cool natural experiment that some authors studied. It's really hard to think, how would you ever test this idea? Because what would it mean to test it is you would have a couple different fields of knowledge, and one of them you would dump a bunch of new knowledge into it, and not the others. You would sort of randomize, and then you would observe what happens to the group that the controls, and then the ones that got all this extra knowledge. And how would you ever do that? Well, this paper argued that happened by accident when the Soviet Union collapsed, because the Soviet Union had this really strong mathematical tradition, and Soviet scientists were isolated from the rest of the world and were not allowed really to participate in conferences, to publish in outside journals, and a lot of stuff was kept inside the Soviet Union and not shared. And so there were domains of math that Soviet mathematicians had progressed really far, like further than the West. And then there were other domains where they had not, that the West had sort of outperformed. And this paper compared what happened, basically used this to replicate that experiment. So when the Iron Curtain fell, the fields where the Soviets had been really strong, all that work got translated, all those scientists began to emigrate. And it was like these mathematical fields suddenly got this influx of new knowledge. And then there were these other fields where the Soviet Union's contribution wasn't that useful, and they were kind of unaffected by this. And so the fields where they had this higher knowledge, you would expect to then see bigger teams emerge as people need to sort of divide and conquer the problems, and then you would expect to see more specialization, and that's exactly what this paper found. They didn't look to see if the mathematicians got older. There is also, and that's because basically I don't think they had enough time. This all happened in like a space of 4 or 5 years.
Awesome. So moving on from that, so when we look, so a couple of things I want to talk about here. So when we took a look at applied innovation, for example, so mostly not the scientific academic work, but something that, more in a corporate environment, you learn as you gain capabilities. Mm-hmm. Again, you wrote an article, The Slowdown We Wanted. Mm-hmm. So when you said that, when US outsourced a lot of its manufacturing capability, it also sort of lost some of its innovation capability, because if you don't have that manufacturing capability, you can't really innovate in that space. Can you talk a bit about what the impact of globalization is on innovation capability of a country? I'm sure, while there are losers, there are winners as well on the other end. The country.
Yeah. So I think there's like three things there's three effects of globalization. Sort of two are good and one is bad. One of the good ones is that globalization leads to these large markets. And so that creates a larger incentive to innovate if you can sell to a bigger market. If something's going to cost $1 billion to create and the number of customers goes from 1,000 to 1 million, it might be worth doing in the second case. And we do have evidence from different domains that works as you would expect. Like when there's a bigger market for something, people spend more R&D resources on it. The second effect that's good is immigration. So there's a lot of work on when people immigrate from one country to another, it creates these, they bring the knowledge with them. So there's some wonderful papers about, I say wonderful, but they're about really sad things. Like one of them is like about when the Nazis kicked out all of the politically undesirable and Jewish scientists when they came to power. A lot of them emigrated. A lot of the chemists who were kicked out emigrated to the United States, and they basically seeded this like vibrant chemical industry in the United States. You've got a similar story when the Soviet Union collapsed. As I said before, it wasn't just math. There were other sort of scientific areas that the Soviet Union was particularly strong at, and those you can see that where those scientists immigrated, those countries became stronger in those areas too. And it's not just that the person who did the work in Germany or in the Soviet Union is now just doing the work that they would have done in the same place, but now they're somewhere else. It's that their ideas and their knowledge spreads, and they teach new people, and that field grows around that person. Like I say, they're more like a seed than like a transplant. And there's other domains that have generalized this to look at just immigration in general and not these sort of horrible catastrophes and other things. And it seems like, to me, pretty robust. So those are the two good the two good things. The potential bad thing, as you mentioned, with outsourcing, if you're manufacturing capability, if you're manufacturing here and then you outsource that away, any R or any kind of innovative capacity associated with physically doing the manufacturing is ceded away. Okay, and so there is this long-standing idea called learning by doing, that firms become more efficient at manufacturing with a given manufacturing process the more experience they have with it. And so, it's actually like summarized in this like really simple relationship where every time you double the cumulative total number of, say, cars you've ever produced, the cost tends to fall by a consistent effect. So that's a really old idea. It goes back decades. The empirical evidence for it is not as strong as people think, but I think there is a case that it is certainly like not illusory. Like maybe the effects are overstated for various reasons, which I can go into if you want, but there does seem to really be something there. Like, and it would be surprising if there wasn't. And so if you're not doing the manufacturing, you're giving up those learning by doing things. And there is one paper that looked at this in Taiwan as certain industries in Taiwan offshored to mainland China and others stuck behind. They looked at what happened to innovation. But the net effect is a little bit ambiguous. So in that Taiwanese paper, which is by American economist Lee Branstetter or Greta Glennon, they found that the net effect was really ambiguous because basically the areas where they sort of lost their edge were sort of partially offset by areas where they gained an edge because they kind of reallocated the scientists and people who used to work on those things to different areas. And so it's not 100% clear how bad it was, but I think that to the extent you think expertise in manufacturing a certain thing is important, when you offload it, you can expect to basically lose something.
Awesome. So this reminds me, there's an article I read, and it's not really innovation related, but I think it was in Vox. And why does it cost so much to build things in America? And they talked about a whole bunch of stuff, like cost is one, labor cost, land, and regulatory. But one of the things that they said, and this was in reference to mostly building public transit, is because America doesn't practice enough of it, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess there's something to be said about the organizational capability. Like if you don't build it, like if you don't improve your JFK today, every airport's going to look very, very expensive all the time, right?
Yeah, I mean, in the United States, it seems like, and I'm speaking a little bit more freely here. I don't have I haven't done a lot of work on infrastructure, but I think it seems, from what I've read, like the United States seems, decidedly uninterested in trying to learn from the experiences of other countries and how well we just sort of had this perspective that the way we do things is great. We're America. And so we're not learning from what other countries are doing well. And if we don't do much, that wouldn't necessarily be that bad because we're a big country. And if we had lots of different countries working on airports and improving them, at least we would learn from each other in the United States, if not from other countries. But if we're not even doing that, we're just really shutting down, and everybody's kind of reinventing the wheel every time they do a new infrastructure project. At least that seems very plausible to me.
So I guess the lesson is, don't worry about the cost, just start building. And
well, that is like one of the implications of these learning by doing models is certainly things are going to get better. And so but they're not going to get better until you sort of start trying. But it's the kind of thing where, that's true, but I would say don't bank on whatever the historical relationship is. It might look really tidy, but a lot of these graphs also will have just things went this way and then the trend just broke and changed into a different direction. And I think it's certainly sensible to think that people get more efficient at building things, and production processes get more efficient when you get more experience. But it is much more of a stretch to be that happens at a rate that is consistent over a really long time period. There's not necessarily a reason to believe that would be true. And I think that the evidence that it is true is weaker than people sometimes think.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about So innovation obviously is dependent a lot on the scientific progress, research. One of the things you wrote was about conservatism in science,
Mhm.
mostly within academia. Can you explain that a little bit? And secondly, how do you incentivize the behavior to change? Like, how do you change that behavior? What are the incentives would you propose?
Yeah, so the conservatism in science, there's this old idea that science is too risk averse. And that was kind of what that piece was about, and looking at why might that be. And in a nutshell, the idea is science is pretty competitive. There's not that many grants. There's not that many pages in journals that are available, and judging what is the most meritable, which proposal has the most merit, which journal article deserves to be published best. These are questions that are not easily answerable. Like you can't just see. There's no instant index or number you can see which one is the best idea. Instead, you have to use judgment, and the only people who have judgment that is typically able the only people who have expertise enough to judge what's good and what's bad tend to be other scientists working on the same cutting edge frontier. And the issue is that people know a lot about what they're working on. They know a lot about what sort of what is in the kind of consensus view because they've studied it, and it is harder to judge outlier ideas. Typically, not always, but typically, an idea that's way out there and away from sort of conventional wisdom and away from your area of expertise is just going to be harder to assess confidently. You may actually really like the idea, but because you're like, but it's really weird, so I don't know if it will work. Instead of giving it a 10 out of 10, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. And then in a world that's really competitive, if this other research question is right in your field and it's like right down the middle, you know exactly what they're proposing, you understand, you think it's promising, you might give that a 10 out of 10. And that kind of gives this handicap to anything that's really novel. In a competitive environment where we can only fund stuff that's, say, like rated 9 or 10 and above, everything that's like, all these really weird ideas don't quite clear the threshold, and so they never really get investigated. And that paper was looking at a variety of strands of evidence that that's the case. Like one example is people who are applying for grants are more likely to get the grant if the people reviewing their application have previously cited their work. So I like what you're doing. I've cited it, and when you propose an application, I'm more likely to grant it. But people who do really weird stuff, their stuff doesn't tend to be cited as well by people in the same research community. It tends to be cited later, maybe with a delay, or by people in other fields. This takes longer for a consensus to emerge, and so those people are kind of at a disadvantage. And you can just directly see people who do kind of weirder, more outlier research in one study anyway from like Sweden have a harder time getting these kind of grants. And so that creates this incentive for you to kind of just stick with what everybody else is doing and try to do that really well. But you're not going to get very well rewarded for this outside weird stuff. So one way to sort of incentivize the weirder stuff is, literally just if we can remove some of the level of competition in science so that we fund everything that's rated 6 or above, we just have a lot more resources. Well, maybe there's some space for weird ideas to get funding. That's one idea. Another would be people have proposed things like, instead of taking the average score of a bunch of reviewers, like take have some place for the maximum score. So like if one person recognizes that this idea is really strong, put more weight on that than just, averaging across sort of, and so you get more individual decisions instead of decisions by committee. Other ideas that people have proposed, like one idea is literally just another way to reduce the competition, the sort of competitive element, is distribute funding via lotteries. Like they wouldn't necessarily be total lotteries. They might be, you have to clear a threshold. We have to give you at least a 6 out of 10 or something. But then after that, we just randomize who we give the money to because maybe we're worried that we're missing this transformative research. And then the other idea is to reduce sort of that level, give people freedom, is to just give them kind of block grants. Like, here's just some money, you can do whatever you want with it. Maybe it's not that much. Maybe it's like how Google used to give people a 20%, 20% projects so that they could work on stuff one day a week that was not critical to their mission. That might be another idea. The evidence for all those proposals that I've given, though, is what I've told you is basically the evidence. Like, they sound sensible, but they haven't been. Most of them haven't been tried and evaluated in any kind of like really rigorous way.
So, is there anything where maybe a governmental agency, or like, can governments take a lead and maybe build, like do something about it, like a public-private partnership or something along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it would be great to see the government experiment a bit more with how it gives out grants, because that's a big constraint on how people what topics they choose to work on. And so you could certainly have governments experiment with all of these ideas, like change, and we could evaluate it, see if it really works, like change how we evaluate grants and compare it to like randomly set people in different groups, or at least open new programs where if your project doesn't get funded in this one, we shunt you to this, experimental thing. So you could do all that. The government has in the past, like for agriculture, for example, the Department of Agriculture used to give these block grants that were formula based, tied to sort of the size of agriculture and your state and other things, rather than reading grant proposals and giving money out that way. And, so there is precedent for trying that kind of stuff. In terms of public-private partnerships, I mean, those could work for some kinds of, those would work for, I guess, in some situations where where it's sort of mutually advantageous. There's this really new kind of idea called focused research organizations. It's really interesting about recognizing that business has an incentive to kind of get technologies across the finish line and get them to market, but it's hard for them to do long run fundamental research because the payoff is so far away and so uncertain. Government is on the other side. They are able to fund fundamental research, but they don't necessarily have a comparative advantage in commercializing it. And the academic system is really well set up for individual scientists pursuing individual projects, but not very well set up for integrating all those into sort of a new technology or a package. And so this idea is to create this organization that I kind of see as in between these, called a focused research organization, where we hire a startup, like it's a nonprofit startup basically, to pull together all the academic ideas and develop a prototype technology that is close enough that then we can hand it to the private sector and they can spin it out into lots of applications and sort of take it across the finish line. But kind of as this burden of knowledge gets harder, as problems basically get harder, it may be that we need to sort of rethink how we've organized things and create new organizations that can help, get things all the way from new idea all the way to sort of a technology.
Yeah, and that's something Mariana Mazzucato has argued as well in the past, right? Like, because she always gives the example that NIH has, funded a lot of research, which the pharmaceutical companies have been able to leverage off of.
Yep.
DARPA has helped out with GPS, internet, like all of that came out of the government. So it's not as if the government doesn't have that capability.
Yeah, I mean, I think the government funding of basic science is super valuable, and we should do a lot more of it. But it's tricky because the payoffs are very, it's hard for any individual congressional person is not going to necessarily. The payoffs take a long time, like decades. GPS. There was decades between when DARPA developed it and when we were using it to track when we're running. That's like way too long for anybody and any politician to basically be able to say, use that to run on re-election, basically.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, as we move towards the end of the show, there's one type of innovation I'm curious about and that's home innovation, right? So I know earlier you mentioned sometimes ideas come like it's an evolution. Like you see a problem, you solve it at home. Um, I was reading a couple of articles about it as well, and like it said it can even contribute to and I don't remember the exact percentage, but it said a really high percentage of GDP. How much do you think home innovation matters? And in a world where everything is becoming so specialized, do you still see it as a viable, I guess?
Yeah. So for home innovation, just to clarify, you mean like innovations that people just do on their own initiative, on their own
Correct.
time? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is not. There's this economist who studied this. His last name is von Hippel, and he's written books about it. And you can't study this in the traditional ways that we study. They don't seek patents, they don't do this or that. So he's commissioned, or he's been part of groups that commission surveys, and that's how they try to measure this stuff. And they looked at a lot of different countries, and I think they found it varies from country to country, but it's sort of in the ballpark of 5% of people have maybe done something like this, invented some product of their own for their own use in the last year, or whatever the time frame of the survey was. And they tried to evaluate what's the value generated, or valuing people's efforts at the prevailing wage rate, and looking at how much they spent on the innovation, how much are they spending, what is the value of all this R&D effort that's not being measured. And I think it was roughly on a par with, like, again, sort of 5% of total R&D. But when you compare it to sort of like private sector consumer focused innovation, which is similar kind of end products, like developing products for consumers, then it looks a lot bigger. Like it's roughly, it's closer to comparable. I don't think they are still equal, but it's not like totally out of whack with it. So it's an interesting subfield. Like the challenge is, like, the market creates very large incentives to develop something, right? Because you can sell it, and you can sell it to an audience, and so you can, you're willing to spend a lot more effort to develop it. But what home innovation can do that the private market can't necessarily do is, for one, you can just give those ideas away. You don't have to protect them with patents or anything like that, and so that can allow for that can itself be like kind of a superpower for these types of inventions. So like the open source software movement is a good example of how effective that kind of not needing to protect things and letting just other people build on your work can be really powerful. And the other area that's interesting is home innovation, as you call it, has sometimes been really important for pioneering new kind of products and niches. Like, and I think the idea here is that if I'm a private company, I think von Hippel has some examples. I want to say it's like with like whitewater rafting or something, like new kinds of kayaks, but I might have this a little bit wrong. But anyway, this was developed by this community of hobbyists, right? And they developed this new way of either this new type of technology for doing this, like a new kind of boat or something. And the idea is that they are in the community, they know what they want, and they know they have a vision of sort of what it would be and that they would really like to have it. And so they have an incentive to basically try to satisfy their own desires to develop this thing. And the private sector company, once it is developed, they're like, "Oh, I didn't know this was I didn't know people wanted this." And so they take up the baton from that point, and they scale up the manufacturing. They sort of professionalize it, and maybe they can take the ball running from there and improve it, whatever, in ways that the individuals can't. But the individuals made this fundamental contribution of sort of demonstrating as like a proof of concept that this is a thing people want and it's a new type of thing. And a private sector firm may have never realized that, because the people who are, even like if there were whitewater rafters, like in the company, in the R&D company, they might naively believe that nobody else wants this new kind of boat. But an individual is like, I don't care about everybody. I just want one. I just want something for myself and for maybe my friends. And so they have kind of like they have a piece of information that's sort of missing from maybe the private sector. So anyway, I think it's interesting, but I do think the challenges in certain domains where the burden of knowledge is really high, and push the front, like to develop a new vaccine, for example, is really hard to do
For sure.
on your own. But there are certainly plenty of other domains where I think it can be. I think it can certainly happen. And as we get things like 3D printing and other stuff that makes it easier for an individual to tinker and build prototypes, it will continue to be important.
Yeah, one of the examples I think he also gave was mountain bikes and how people think about the tires and that. And it's interesting. I guess this is one thing where probably face might be a little bit better. Remote might not work very well for.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, the other one example I think that has been given a lot is like new scientific instruments. So like scientists are like, I need this instrument to solve this problem that I'm having. They develop it, and then once it exists, professional companies are like, oh, that's cool. We'll do that too. But they wouldn't have done it without that first prod.
Yeah. So before we end, the theme of our show is the future, right? So when you talk about innovation, obviously scientific progress is an important piece. Technology goes without saying. Any topic we discuss these days, technology is a big factor. But what other factors do you think in the future will shape innovation besides just scientific progress or technology?
Yeah. Let me think about that. Because I remember you asked. So I think going forward, one thing that is really going to drive, or like the big overarching trend that I sort of see, is this continuing burden of knowledge problem. Like we're going to keep seeing like innovation getting this, harder, requiring bigger teams, more coordination, sort of like this organizational, maybe organizational reform, especially if we have more remote teams. We have to figure out how to coordinate that kind of group in a way that is, maybe not going to be the same as how we did things in the past. Other than that, like other factors that I think are important, like people talk about, like I think immigration policy might turn out to be important in the long run. Like if the United States withdraws from the world, the United States, for better or worse, is kind of the global leader, like sometimes referred to by like there's a guy, Caleb Watney, who call it like the United States the R&D lab of the world. And we have an outsized share of the top universities, the top tech companies, and so on. And if we can continue to draw bright young minds, and I don't know, just bright minds to the United States to work and continue like that stuff, that's really good, I think, for the world. But it also depends on sort of politics, like not just technology. I think that, as I said earlier, like a more remote world where there's more collaboration at a distance it's uncertain what the sort of net effect will be. There's potential that it will enable new collaborations where between people on different coasts. I actually think that this might interact with the burden of knowledge in an important way, where if you need larger and larger teams of ever more specialized people, it might become impossible to find all those people in the same place at the same time. And so you're just going to have to find a way to make it work remotely, because you've got to find your nanotech specialist in Texas and your software integration specialist for nanotechnology in Seattle, whatever. And then I think another sort of non-technological factor that matters is representation from diverse groups among sort of the innovating elite. There's evidence about, for example, people, like when you decide what to work on, you do your own historical and like lifetime experience influences what you think are important questions. And as women moved into the scientific labor force, for example, you started to see more attention paid to health issues and biology issues related to women. And I think that is like not that's just like a case study that is easy to study, but it could be throughout like if we have a really unequal society, we may get more innovation that caters to to people to a small group of people willing to pay a great deal of money for certain kinds of inventions. And if we have a society that's less unequal, then maybe people will try to find less expensive broadly, like maybe that will incentivize people to work on that. So I think the kind of society that we live in affects the kind of innovation we get, and also sort of shapes it in turn. And also the kind of people who are able to work as inventors affects the kinds of people who are kind of catered to in terms of what technologies and scientific ideas are investigated.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for your time. Before we let you go, for levity, we always ask our guests this question. Is there one book that you would recommend our listeners and viewers, one TV show, and one movie?
All right. If you're interested in innovation and stuff, I think a book that I really like, I mentioned it very briefly at the beginning, The Secret of Our Success by Joseph Henrich, is a great book about, he doesn't really pitch it as a book about innovation, but I think that it is largely a book about how innovation sort of really got started with the human race, and what made the human race and the human animal, I guess, different from the kind that came before it. It's not necessarily that we're that much smarter than other ones. It's that we can work together, and so problems. It's not that our brains are big enough to tackle problems. It's that we can communicate enough to break the problems into small enough parts that we can handle. So that's a great book. A TV show. I'll have to come back to that in a second. And then for a movie, like I don't know of any particularly good innovation movies. I can just tell you that like one of my favorite movies is There Will Be Blood. A little bit about how a little bit, I guess, about a technology, but really just a portrait of a person and his complicated relationship with his son. And then a TV show. I don't know. Right now, I'm watching The Expanse, and I'm enjoying it.
Perfect. Well, Matt Clancy, thank you so much, and we hope to have you back on the show again sometime in the future.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. Great to talk to you. Bye.
Bye. We hope you enjoyed our episode. Your feedback is always appreciated. You can email us at futureof19@gmail.com. You can also visit our website at www.ftrof.com, as well as follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at futureof19. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Future Of. Please leave us your comments about what you liked, what you didn't, and what would you like to focus on for future episodes. We'd love to hear from you. And lastly, if you are enjoying our episodes, if you enjoyed Season 1, looking forward to Season 2, please consider supporting us at Patreon at www.patreon.com/futureof19. Thank you very much for your support, and have yourself a wonderful day.